The hat was too old for the boy, or perhaps the boy was too young for the hat. It sat on his head like a borrowed crown, its wide brim shadowing a face that had not yet earned the deep line and hard-won wisdom the hat itself seemed to possess. The town of Sovereign Creek watched him arrive, its gaze as flat and dusty as the street he rode down. This was a place that had seen its share of dreamers and drifters, a boom and bust town whose brief silver fever had long since broken, leaving behind a residue of quiet desperation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, drop a comment below with where you're listening from and the local time on your side of the prairie. It's always a joy to know how far these old tales travel. And this is how a stolen hat set a fire that would either forge a boy into a man or burn him to ash. His name was Leo Vance, and he was all of 19 years old. He was whip-thin and mud with an awkward caution, as if he were still growing into his own frame. He rode a tired-looking sorrel, and his clothes were the simple, threadbare garb of a young man who owned little more than what was on his back. But the hat was another story entirely. It was a magnificent thing, a Boss of the Plains-style Stetson made of fine, silver-belly beaver felt. It was weathered, yes, stained with the sweat of 100 hard days and the dust of 1,000 miles, but its quality was unmistakable. The crown was high and creased into a sharp cattleman's crease, and a small, simple silver concho was affixed to the leather band, its only adornment. It was the hat of a man of substance, of authority, a lawman, perhaps, or a cattle baron. It was not the hat of a boy who looked like he'd have trouble growing a proper beard. The people of Sovereign Creek saw this contradiction, and it made them uneasy. In the West, you sized a man up by his gear, and Leo Vance was a walking paradox. They watched from the saloon doors and the windows of the general store as he dismounted in front of Martha's Place, the town's only eatery. He tied his horse loosely to the hitching rail and paused, his hand resting on the hat's brim, a gesture that was both protective and hesitant. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The eatery was a clean, orderly establishment run by a woman whose demeanor matched the decor. Martha was in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that didn't miss a thing and hair pulled back in a severe but practical bun. She watched Leo enter, her gaze immediately drawn, like everyone else's, to the hat. But her look was different. It was not one of simple curiosity or suspicion. It was a look of sharp, sudden, and carefully concealed recognition. Her eyes lingered on the specific way the brim was shaped, on the small silver concho, and a flicker of some deep, old memory passed behind her eyes. Leo, feeling the weight of the room's attention, removed the hat as he approached a small table in the corner. He didn't toss it casually aside. He held it in both hands for a moment before placing it carefully, crown down, on the empty chair beside him, a gesture of profound respect. Without the hat, he looked even younger, his face boyish and uncertain, his eyes holding a haunted, weary look that didn't match his years. "Just coffee and beans, ma'am," he said quietly, when Martha came to his table, his voice barely rising above the low murmur of the other patrons. "Comin' right up," she replied, her voice neutral, though her eyes once again darted to the hat resting on the chair. Leo could feel their stares. He felt them every time he walked into a new town. The hat was both his shield and his burden. It was a constant, heavy reminder of a promise he had made, a promise he felt less capable of keeping with every passing day. He was just a boy, playing dress-up in a dead man's legacy. He felt like an imposter, and he assumed everyone else saw him that way too. He kept his eyes down, focusing on the worn grain of the wooden table, hoping to become invisible. But in a town like Sovereign Creek, a puzzle like Leo Vance could not be ignored. The other patrons, a pair of ranch hands, a prospector, a freight driver, all whispered amongst themselves. Where did a boy like that get a hat like that? Did he steal it? Win it in a card game he had no business being in? Or was it perhaps a sign of something else? In the harsh arithmetic of the frontier, a man was the sum of his possessions. Leo's sum didn't add up, and that made him a dangerous variable in the town's simple, weary equation. He was a question, and Sovereign Creek did not like questions it couldn't answer. The quiet in Martha's place was a fragile thing, a temporary peace in a town that had learned to hold its breath. It shattered the moment the Blackwood brothers kicked open the door. They didn't enter so much as make an occupation. Their loud voices and the arrogant ring of their spurs on the floorboards sucking all the air out of the room. Clay, the elder, was broad-shouldered and handsome in a brutish way, with a cruel smirk that never quite left his face. His younger brother, Jeb, was a slighter, meaner version of the same stock, a hyena who laughed at the lion's jokes. They were the sons of the valley's biggest rancher, a man who had amassed a small empire of land and cattle through a series of shrewd, government-backed land grants. And his sons moved through the world with the absolute certainty that it belonged to them. Their eyes swept the room, looking for something to amuse themselves with, and they landed on Leo. Or more specifically, they landed on the hat, sitting like a silent declaration of importance on the chair beside the quiet boy. "Well, well, Jeb, looky here," Clay drawled, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. He sauntered over to Leo's table, his brother a pace behind him. The few other patrons in the eatery suddenly found the contents of their coffee cups incredibly interesting. "Looks like we found a baby bird trying to wear an eagle's feathers." Leo went still, his hands resting on the table. He could feel a cold dread creeping up his spine. He had faced this kind of man before in other dusty towns, men who used cruelty as a language to assert their place at the top of the pecking order. "That's a mighty fine hat for a skinny pup like you," Clay continued, leaning over the table, his shadow falling across Leo. "Where'd a boy like you get a man's hat? Steal it off a scarecrow?" "It was a gift," Leo said, his voice barely a whisper. He kept his eyes on the table, trying to make himself small, hoping they would grow bored and move on. "A gift?" Clay scoffed, grabbing the chair with the hat on it and pulling it out. Who in their right mind would give a hat like this to a half-starved coyote? "Let me have a look." Instinct took over. As Clay's hand reached for the brim, Leo's own hand shot out, covering the crown protectively. It was a reflexive, desperate gesture, born of the promise he'd made. For a single, fleeting second, a fire of pure defiance burned in the boy's eyes. It was a mistake. Clay's smirk widened. He grabbed Leo's wrist, his grip like a steel trap. With a casual, contemptuous twist, he wrenched Leo's arm away. "Don't get brave, boy," he hissed, his face close to Leo's. "It's not a good look for you." With his other hand, he snatched the hat. He held it up, inspecting the fine felt, the silver concho glinting in the light. "Now this," he said with mock admiration, "is a real hat." He turned and placed it on his own head. It settled perfectly, looking more at home on his larger frame than it ever had on Leo's. He strutted around the small eatery, preening for his brother and the cowed audience. "See, Jeb? Now that's how a man wears a hat. Fits me proper. I think I'll keep it. A man of my standing deserves a crown." Jeb howled with laughter. Clay tipped the brim in a mocking farewell to Leo, his eyes full of the casual cruelty of a man who has never been denied anything in his life. Then, with the stolen hat sitting proudly on his head, he and his brother swaggered out of the eatery, leaving a wake of stunned silence. They had not just stolen an object. They had stolen a piece of a man's dignity, his purpose, simply because they could. It was an act of casual, thoughtless tyranny. Leo sat frozen at his table, his face burning with a shame so profound it felt like a physical illness. His wrist throbbed where Clay had grabbed it, but that pain was nothing compared to the agony in his soul. He had failed. He had been given one job, one sacred duty, to protect the hat, to see it through, and he had failed within his first hour in this town. He felt the weight of his broken promise settle on him, a crushing invisible force. He risked a glance up, and his eyes met Martha's from behind the counter. He expected to see pity, or perhaps the same dismissal he saw in the other averted faces. But he saw neither. Her expression was like flint, her eyes narrowed with a cold, hard anger that seemed to mirror his own. She wasn't looking at the humiliated boy. She was looking at the empty chair where the hat had been. And in that shared look of righteous fury, a silent, unspoken alliance was forged. She knew. Shame was a physical weight, pressing Leo down into his chair long after the Blackwood brothers had gone. The eatery emptied out quickly, the other patrons shuffling away, not wanting to be caught in the blast radius of a bully's attention. The silence they left behind was thick and suffocating, broken only by the buzzing of a lazy fly near the window. Leo stared at the empty chair beside him, the space where the hat had been, a hollow ache spreading through his chest. He had failed. The promise he had carried for 300 miles had been broken in a dusty, forgotten town by a laughing fool. The thought of facing his mentor's memory with this failure was a burden too heavy to contemplate. He expected Martha to tell him to pay for his coffee and leave. He was trouble, a magnet for the kind of casual violence that could ruin a small business. Instead, he heard the soft clink of a bowl being placed on the table in front of him. He looked up. She had set a steaming bowl of thick, dark stew before him. "On the house," she said, her voice gruff, betraying no pity. "It's son of a gun stew. It'll either put hair on your chest or burn a hole through you. Either way, you look like you could use it." Leo stared at the unexpected act of kindness, unable to speak. He felt he didn't deserve it. I can't pay for that," he stammered, his eyes fixed on the table. "I'm not asking you to," Martha replied, her tone sharp. She didn't move away. She stood by the table, her arms crossed, studying him. "Are you going to let them get away with it?" The question caught him off guard. He mumbled something about not wanting any more trouble, about how they were too strong. His voice was a weak, hollow thing. Martha cut him off, her voice dropping lower, imbued with a sudden, fierce intensity. "That wasn't just any hat, boy. That was Tom Hatcher's hat." Leo's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. He stared at her, speechless. How could this woman, in this forgotten town, know? "Don't look so surprised," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "I'd know that silver concho anywhere. Tom bought it from a Navajo silversmith in Santa Fe 10 years ago. Said it reminded him of a star you can only see in the high desert. And the crease, he always creased it just so. A man's hat is like his signature." She paused, her eyes searching his young, frightened face. "Now, you're going to tell me how a boy like you ended up with a dead Marshal's hat." The secret, which had been his solitary burden for so long, came tumbling out. "He was my friend," Leo said, his voice cracking. "My mentor. I was with him when he passed. He asked me to." Leo trailed off, the full weight of the promise too heavy to speak aloud to a stranger. "He gave it to me." Martha's expression softened, a barely perceptible shift in the hard lines of her face. "Tom Hatcher ate at this very table 3 times a week for 5 years, back when he was the circuit marshal for this whole territory. He drank his coffee black as sin and always complained it wasn't bitter enough. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. He was a good man. The last good man this valley has seen in a long time. Her expression hardened again as she looked toward the door where the Blackwoods had swaggered out. Which brings me back to my question. What are you going to do about it? That hat stands for justice in this territory. Or it used to. And those boys who took it, Clay and Jeb Blackwood, they stand for nothing but their daddy's money and their own rotten character. Their father, Silas Blackwood, owns half this county and thinks the law is something he can wipe his boots on. The sheriff we have now, he's too scared of Blackwood to arrest a man for spitting on the boardwalk, let alone for theft. She was laying the truth out for him, bare and brutal. She was telling him that he was alone, that the odds were impossible, that the official law would offer him no shelter. She was testing him, looking to see if there was any trace of Tom Hatcher's steel behind the boy's frightened eyes. Leo looked from Martha's hard, expectant face to the bowl of stew. He thought of Marshal Hatcher, of his final, ragged breaths, of the weight of the hat as he'd placed it in Leo's hands. To run now would be to fail him completely, to prove that he was just the weak, scared boy the Blackwoods saw. He picked up the spoon. He took a bite of the stew. It was rich and hot, and it seemed to burn away some of the cold shame in his belly. It tasted like a second chance. He looked up and met Martha's gaze, and for the first time, his own was steady. "I'm going to get it back," he said. His voice was still quiet, but the weakness was gone, replaced by a thin, new thread of iron. Martha gave a single, sharp nod, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. "Good," she said, her work done. "Eat up. You're going to need your strength." The hot stew seemed to ignite a fire in Leo's belly, a warmth that pushed back against the cold shame that had settled in his bones. As he took another spoonful, the clatter and low murmur of Martha's eatery faded away, replaced by the memory of a different heat, a different silence. The image bloomed in his mind, vivid and terrible, from 2 weeks before. He was not in a dusty town, but in a sun-baked canyon somewhere in the New Mexico territory, the hard granite pressing into his knees, the air smelling of hot rock and gunpowder. He was desperately trying to stop the bleeding. The front of Marshal Tom Grizzly Hatcher's shirt was a dark, spreading stain of crimson. The shot had come from a high ridge a half-mile away, the work of a patient sniper with a high-powered Sharps rifle. It was not a fight. It was an execution. Hatcher, the toughest lawman Leo had ever known, a man who had faced down entire gangs without flinching, had been laid low by a killer he never even saw. "Stop, son," Hatcher had rasped, his big hand, surprisingly gentle, covering Leo's own frantic ones. "Save your shirt. There's no plugging this hole." The marshal, a man who had looked death in the face 1,000 times, recognized it now as it laid a final claim on him. His breathing was a shallow, rattling thing. "Listen to me, Leo. There's no time." His eyes, still sharp despite the pain, were filled with a desperate urgency. "They weren't after me. Not really." He coughed, a fleck of blood appearing on his lips. "They were after this." With a grimace of effort, he reached inside his coat and pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped package. He pushed it into Leo's hands. It felt heavy, dense with importance. "It's all in here. Everything. The evidence to burn Silas Corrigan's whole empire to the ground." The name meant little to Leo then, but the way Hatcher said it, with a mixture of hatred and fear, made it sound like a curse. "Corrigan's not just an outlaw, boy," Hatcher explained, his voice growing weaker. "He's a disease. He owns mines, ranches, politicians. He looks like a gentleman, lives in a big house in Santa Fe, but he built his fortune on blood and misery. This book," he tapped the package in Leo's hand, "has the ledgers, the witness statements, the proof of it all. It's my life's work, my final case." He coughed again, a racking sound that shook his large frame. "You can't trust the law in this territory. Corrigan's got too many badges in his pocket. You have to take this to Judge Henry Albright, in Denver. He's a federal judge, an honest man, the only one with the power and the guts to act on what's in this journal." He was giving Leo an impossible task, a journey of hundreds of miles through dangerous territory, carrying a piece of evidence that a powerful, ruthless man would kill to keep hidden. Leo felt a wave of pure, paralyzing terror. He was just a boy. An orphan Hatcher had taken under his wing, a deputy in name only, tasked with filing paperwork and looking after the horses. "I can't," Leo had whispered, the words choked with tears. "Tom, I can't." "You have to," Hatcher insisted, his grip on Leo's arm surprisingly strong. "They'll be looking for a marshal to be carrying this. For a man. They won't be looking for a boy." With his last ounce of strength, Hatcher reached up and removed his own hat. It was his signature, a thing as legendary as the man himself. He placed it on Leo's head. It was heavy, and it slipped down over the boy's eyes, smelling of trail dust, sweat, and the faint familiar scent of Hatcher's pipe tobacco. "Wear it," Hatcher commanded, his voice a ragged breath. "It'll confuse him. A boy in a man's hat. It'll buy you time. It's all I can give you." He looked deep into Leo's eyes, his own gaze starting to cloud over. "Promise me, Leo. Promise me you'll see it home. Get the book to Albright. Finish the job. Promise me." What could he do? This man had been the only father he had ever known. He had saved him from a life of poverty and neglect. Swallowing his fear, Leo nodded, the oversized hat bobbing ludicrously. "I promise, Tom," he whispered. "I promise." A faint smile touched the dying Marshal's lips. It was a look of relief, of a burden finally past. Then his eyes went vacant, and the great Tom Hatcher was gone. Leo was alone in the canyon, the silence broken only by the wind and his own terrified sobs, with a dead man at his feet, a damning journal in his pocket, and a legend's crown on his head. The memory dissolved. Leo was back in the eatery, the spoon shaking slightly in his hand. The weight of the promise was as real and as heavy as it had been that day. And now, the symbol of that promise, the one tool he had been given to survive, was gone. Stolen by a common bully. The thought filled him not with fear, but with a new and unfamiliar emotion. A hot, clarifying anger. For Clay Blackwood, the hat was not a legacy. It was a prop. It was a testament to his own casual power, a trophy won in a battle of humiliation that he had, in his own mind, already rewritten as an act of dominance. He swaggered back into the saloon, the hat sitting at a jaunty, disrespectful angle on his head, and slapped a silver dollar on the bar. He bought a round of whiskey for his brother and a few other sycophants, who orbited his family's wealth like moths around a lantern. "To my new crown," he toasted, his voice booming through the quiet saloon. He told them a loud, embellished tale of how a shifty-eyed drifter had tried to get brave with him, and how he, Clay Blackwood, had put the boy in his place and claimed the hat as a rightful prize. In his version of the story, he was not a bully. He was a dispenser of frontier justice, a man who would not tolerate disrespect in his town. His hangers-on laughed and clapped him on the back, their loyalty as cheap as the whiskey he was pouring down their throats. Wearing the hat was like wearing a costume of authority. He felt it magnified his presence, lent him a gravitas he had not earned. He left the saloon and began a slow, deliberate parade through Sovereign Creek, ensuring everyone saw his new acquisition. He nodded condescendingly to the merchants, tipped the brim to a group of Mexican vaqueros who were mending a harness, and generally moved with the air of a man surveying his kingdom. But he wore the hat all wrong. He wore it tipped far back on his head, a gesture of lazy arrogance. On Tom Hatcher, the hat had been a symbol of grim, steadfast duty. On Clay Blackwood, it was a cheap joke. He stopped at the livery stable, ostensibly to check on a prize bull his father had recently purchased. He spoke to the livery owner with a tone of imperious command, using the hat to punctuate his status. "Make sure you're feeding him the top-grade alfalfa, not that cheap prairie hay you palm off on the drifters," he ordered, jabbing a thumb toward the bull's pen. The hat was his scepter, his visual tool for reminding everyone of the pecking order. From across the street, the town's sheriff, a paunchy, middle-aged man named Gable, with a perpetually worried expression, watched the display. He was standing on the porch of his office, and when he saw Clay, his eyes went wide. He recognized the hat instantly. Everyone in the territory, who had been around for more than 5 years, recognized Tom Hatcher's hat. A flicker of alarm, of civic duty, crossed the sheriff's face. He knew he should ask about it. A dead Marshal's effects were federal property, and more than that, a mystery that needed solving. He took a half step off the porch, but then Clay turned, caught the sheriff's eye, and gave him a slow, challenging smirk. The smirk said it all. "I am a Blackwood. This is my town. What are you going to do about it?" The sheriff's courage, what little he had, withered under that look. He stopped, turned back to his office door, and began to fuss with a loose hinge, suddenly finding it the most interesting object in the world. He had made his choice. He would not see the hat. He would not ask the question. He would let the sleeping dog lie, even if it was sleeping on a powder keg. From her window, Martha watched this silent, cowardly transaction, and her lips tightened into a thin, angry line. Clay, emboldened by the sheriff's submission, continued his parade. The sun grew hotter, and with a theatrical sigh, he removed the hat and began to fan his face with it, bending the stiff, wide brim back and forth with a callous disregard for its shape. Then, seeing a layer of dust on his expensive leather chaps, he used the crown of the hat to slap it away, the sharp thwack of felt on leather echoing in the quiet street. It was a gesture of such profound disrespect, using a symbol of justice as a common dust rag, that it made Martha's blood run cold. He laughed, rejoined his brother Jeb in the middle of the street, and clapped him on the back. He stood there, the king of his dusty castle, a fool wearing a hero's crown. The hat on his head was a beacon, sending a signal he could not comprehend. He thought it signaled his own importance. He was wrong. It was a signal fire, an announcement to the entire territory. And somewhere out in the vast, dangerous plains, far more predatory eyes were about to be drawn to its light. He was a man who specialized in noticing things. His name was Fletcher, and his trade was information, gathering it, assessing it, and reporting it back to the man who paid him, Silas Corrigan. Fletcher was passing through Sovereign Creek on his way to check on one of Corrigan's less legitimate mining interests, a task that required a quiet presence and a keen eye for trouble. He was nursing a lukewarm coffee in Martha's place, listening to the town's idle gossip, when Clay Blackwood made his second triumphant entrance of the day, the stolen hat still perched on his head. Fletcher didn't react, not outwardly. His heart didn't race, and his hand didn't move toward the pistol holstered under his coat. He simply went still, a predator that has caught a strange and unexpected scent on the wind. He had never met Marshal Tom Hatcher, but he had been shown a photograph, a detailed description supplied by his employer. Corrigan was a meticulous man, and he made sure his key operatives knew the faces of his enemies. Fletcher knew that face, and more importantly, he knew that hat. He had studied the photograph of Hatcher wearing it, noting the specific crease, the wide brim, and the small, distinctive silver concho. He watched as Clay bragged and swaggered, his mind working with cold, efficient precision. This made no sense. Hatcher was dead, shot from a distance and buried in an unmarked grave weeks ago. The official report, the one Corrigan's influence had ensured was filed, listed him as missing, presumed dead after a fall. So, how was his most defining possession now sitting on the head of some strutting fool in a backwater town? Fletcher calmly finished his coffee, paid his nickel, and left the eatery. He found a man idly whittling on a bench outside the general store. "Afternoon," Fletcher said, his voice amiable and forgettable. "Quite the character, the one in the fancy hat. Local royalty?" The man chuckled. "That's Clay Blackwood. His daddy owns the valley. Thinks it makes him a king." Fletcher nodded, the information clicking into place. A rancher's son, not a lawman, not a known associate of Hatcher. This was a puzzle, and Fletcher knew Silas Corrigan did not like puzzles. He needed to report it, immediately. He made his way to the end of the street, to the small telegraph office beside the dormant train depot. It was a stiflingly hot room that smelled of ozone and damp paper. The telegraph operator, a small, bird-like man named Mr. Abernathy with a green celluloid eyeshade, looked up from his logbook. "Afternoon?" Abernathy chirped. "What can we do for you?" Fletcher took a pencil and a telegraph slip. He thought for a moment, composing the message with the terse efficiency required for the wire, where every word cost money. The message was addressed to an associate in Santa Fe, who would hand-deliver it to Corrigan. He pushed the slip across the counter. Abernathy adjusted his eyeshade and read the message. His hands, which had been steady a moment before, began to tremble almost imperceptibly. "SC urgent. Hatcher ghost appeared Sovereign Creek. Hat is here, worn by local rancher's son. No sign of journal. Unknown if boy is connected. Awaiting instructions. F." Mr. Abernathy swallowed hard. He had known Tom Hatcher. The Marshal had been a kind man, a man who always asked about Abernathy's family, who tipped him an extra 2 bits for a quickly sent message. He knew the term ghost in this context was not a supernatural one. It was a code, a word for a threat from the past that was supposed to be buried. He knew this message was a death warrant. For a moment, he considered making a mistake. A slip of the finger, a garbled word, a transmission lost to static. It was his duty under federal law to send the message as written, but it was his duty as a decent man to protect the innocent. His eyes darted up to Fletcher's face, a face as cold and impassive as a snake's, and his moral courage evaporated. Fletcher looked like a man who would know if a message was garbled, and who would not be pleased. With a sigh of resignation, Abernathy turned to his telegraph key. The clicking began, sharp and clear in the quiet room. Click, clack, click. Click. Click, clack. With each tap of his finger, he sent the coded words of doom flying down the iron wire. He was sending a call for the vultures to descend on his small, dusty town. He was a good telegraph operator, and today he hated himself for it. The message went out, a ripple spreading through the web of wires that connected the frontier, a serpent of information making its way back to its master. For Leo Vance and for Sovereign Creek, the real trouble was just beginning. The stew had been a bomb, but the purpose it gave him was a fire. When Leo finished the last spoonful, he did not get up to leave. Instead, he gathered his empty bowl and coffee cup and carried them to the counter where Martha was washing dishes. It was a simple, quiet gesture, an offer to pay for his meal with work, the only currency he possessed. Martha looked at him, about to protest, but she saw the look on his face, not of a beggar, but of a young man trying to hold on to the last scraps of his dignity. She nodded and let him help, the two of them working in a comfortable, unspoken silence as the afternoon sun slanted through the dusty windows. When the last of the lunch dishes were washed and stacked, and the eatery was empty, Martha locked the front door. She led Leo not into the main room, but into the kitchen in the back, a space that smelled of baking bread, smoked bacon, and the sharp, clean scent of lye soap. It was her command center, her private domain. "All right, boy," she said, her voice low and serious. "If you're serious about this, you need to know what you're up against." This was the true test. She had offered him food and kindness. Now she was offering him knowledge, a far more dangerous gift. "Tell me everything," Leo said, his voice steady. The boy who had stammered his order just an hour ago was gone, replaced by someone with a core of quiet intensity. Martha proved to be a master of observation, her eatery the central hub of all the town's information. She knew the town's secrets not through idle gossip, but through years of watching, listening, and serving meals to men who let their tongues loosen. She took a piece of charcoal from the stove and, on the surface of a large, scarred butcher block, began to sketch a map. It was a surprisingly accurate layout of Sovereign Creek and the surrounding valley. "This is us," she said, drawing a small square. "And this," she drew a larger square 5 miles to the east, connected by a winding line, "is the Blackwood Ranch. It's a fortress. The old man has a dozen hired guns on his payroll. You go there, and you'll be dead before you get within a mile of the house." She marked an X on the town map. "This is the saloon. Clay and Jeb come here almost every night. They drink until they can barely stand, make trouble for whoever is unfortunate enough to be there, and then ride home late, thinking they're kings of the world." She looked at him, her eyes sharp. "Clay is the peacock. He's arrogant, but he's the fighter. Jeb is the weasel. He's mean, but he'll run if you so much as look at him sideways." She was handing him the tactical layout of his enemy, but she was also showing him the impossibility of his task. A frontal assault was suicide. An appeal to the law was useless. Leo stared at the charcoal map, his mind racing. He wasn't thinking like a brawler, planning a fistfight. He was thinking like Hatcher had taught him. Never fight the enemy on his terms. Control the terrain. Understand his habits. The battle is won before the first shot is fired. He pointed a finger at the winding line connecting the town to the ranch. "Do they ride back together?" Martha looked surprised by the question. "Mostly. Why? Is there a place on the trail that's hidden from the road? A patch of thick woods, a narrow canyon?" he asked, his eyes tracing the line. "About a mile out," she confirmed, her own finger tracing a spot on the map. "Where it cuts through Antelope Draw. It's dark as a pocket in there at night, thick with cottonwoods." Leo nodded slowly, a plan beginning to form, a dangerous spark in his eyes. He wasn't going to the fortress. He wasn't going to the saloon. He was going to the dark, lonely stretch of trail in between. He was going to use their arrogance, their drunkenness, their routine as a weapon against them. Martha watched him, a slow, knowing awe and smile touching her lips for the first time. She saw it then, the ghost of Tom Hatcher's mind at work. Hatcher had never been the fastest gun, but he had been the smartest, a man who could outthink his opponents, who saw the world as a series of tactical problems to be solved. This boy, for all his fear, had his mentor's mind. "It's a fool's plan, you know," she said, though her voice held a new note of respect. "He called me a boy in a man's hat," Leo replied, his voice quiet but hard as iron. "He's about to find out what the boy can do." Martha held his gaze for a long moment, making her decision. "Tomorrow night," she said, her voice a conspirator's whisper. "I'll watch them. When they leave the saloon, I'll put a lantern in the kitchen window. That will be your signal. It'll give you a 20-minute head start to get to the draw." He looked at her, his heart filled with a gratitude so immense it left him speechless. The weight of his promise was still there, a heavy, unyielding burden on his soul. But for the first time since Tom Hatcher had taken his last breath, he did not feel like he was carrying it alone. The clicks of the telegraph key traveled hundreds of miles in an instant, a whisper of iron and lightning, carrying a message of a ghost from a dusty, forgotten town to a world of dark wood and quiet money. In Santa Fe, the nexus of commerce and power in the territory, the decoded message was hand-delivered on a small silver tray to the office of Mr. Silas Corrigan. The office was not the hideout of an outlaw, but the lavish command center of a burgeoning tycoon. A thick Persian rug covered the floor. The walls were lined with leather-bound books that had never been opened, and a large, polished mahogany desk stood before a window overlooking the city's bustling plaza. This was an empire built on a foundation of legitimacy, a facade so perfect that no one ever thought to inspect the rot underneath. Silas Corrigan himself was the picture of respectability. A man in his early 50s, he was impeccably dressed in a tailored Eastern suit, his silvering hair perfectly combed, his hands soft and clean. He was reading the latest stock reports from New York when his associate brought him the telegram. He took the slip of paper, his expression one of mild academic curiosity. He read the words from Fletcher. "SC urgent. Hatcher ghost appeared Sovereign Creek. Hat is here. Worn by local rancher's son. No sign of journal. Unknown if connected. Awaiting instructions." F. For a long moment, Corrigan did not move. His carefully constructed mask of calm remained in place, but a dangerous stillness settled over him. A muscle in his jaw twitched, the only outward sign of the cold fury the message had ignited. "Hatcher's ghost," he murmured to the empty room, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He had been so careful. The sniper was the best. The body was buried deep. The official report was a masterpiece of fiction. He had cut the head off the snake, yet somehow it was still rattling. His mind, a cold and intricate machine, began to work through the possibilities. It couldn't be Hatcher himself. That was impossible. A secret son? Unlikely. Hatcher was a solitary man. A hidden partner? A deputy no one knew about? This was more plausible and more dangerous. Or perhaps it was simpler. Perhaps some fool of a rancher's son had stumbled upon the body, looted it, and was now parading around with a dead man's hat, ignorant of the danger he was courting. But the journal. Hatcher had been carrying his damnable journal, the meticulous record of Corrigan's crimes. If the hat had been found, the journal might have been found with it. That was a risk he could not afford. The uncertainty was a cancer. It had to be cut out. He rang a small silver bell on his desk. The sound was soft, almost delicate. The two men who entered a moment later were not. They were brothers, both dressed in dark, functional clothing, their faces lean and hard, their eyes holding the flat, predatory emptiness of wolves. They were the Pike brothers, his most effective, most discreet, and most adept troubleshooters. They did not speak. They simply stood before the desk, waiting. "Gentlemen," Corrigan began, his voice smooth and low, a chilling contrast to the violence he was about to order. "A minor but irritating loose end has appeared. It involves our late friend, Marshal Hatcher." He slid the telegram across the desk. The brothers read it, their expressions unchanging. They were not paid to have expressions. A boy is wearing the Marshal's hat in a town called Sovereign Creek, Corrigan continued. I want to know who this boy is. I want to know how he came to possess that hat. And most importantly, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper, I want to know if he found anything else with it. Specifically, a small, leather-bound journal. He let the words sink in. Travel to Sovereign Creek. Find the boy. Be discreet. Coax the story out of him. If he has the journal, you will take it. That is your primary objective. Once you have it, or you are certain he does not know of its existence, you will erase the problem. The Pike brothers remained silent, their understanding absolute. Erase the boy, Corrigan clarified, his voice like chipping ice. Erase the hat. If the rancher's son and his family become an obstacle, erase them too. I want Hatcher's ghost laid to rest for good, along with anyone who has seen it. Leave no witnesses. Leave no trace that this conversation ever took place. It was an invitation to unlimited violence, a quiet, gentlemanly order for a massacre if necessary. The brothers gave a single, synchronous nod. It was the only confirmation Corrigan needed. They turned and left the opulent office as silently as they had entered, two ghosts dispatched to hunt another. Corrigan watched them go, then turned to look out the window at the bustling plaza below. He felt a flicker of annoyance at Hatcher's stubborn refusal to stay dead. But it was only a flicker. He had built his empire by identifying threats and eliminating them with surgical precision. This was just another small, necessary procedure. He poured himself a glass of brandy, the picture of calm control, completely unaware that the ghost he had just sent his killers to hunt was not a seasoned lawman, but a terrified boy who was at that very moment planning a simple theft. They did not ride into Sovereign Creek. They seeped into it, like a stain spreading on dry wood. 2 days after Fletcher sent his telegram, 2 riders appeared on the Eastern Trail. They were not boisterous like the Blackwoods, nor weary like a prospector. They rode in a tight, disciplined formation, their horses moving at a steady, ground-eating trot. They were dressed in dark, durable clothing that was devoid of any personality, a uniform of pure function. They were the Pike brothers, Elias and Cole, and their arrival felt like a drop in barometric pressure, a sudden, oppressive stillness before a violent storm. As they moved down the main street, the town's already quiet atmosphere became funereal. The blacksmith's hammer, which had resumed its rhythmic work, faltered and fell silent. A group of children playing with a hoop in the dust were quickly shushed and herded inside by a nervous mother. Doors that had been open to the afternoon air were quietly closed. It was an instinctive, communal recoil, the way a herd of deer freezes at the scent of a wolf on the wind. The town of Sovereign Creek collectively recognized the presence of true predators. The 2 men carried themselves with a chilling professionalism. Their guns were not cheap knockoffs, but long-barreled Colt buntline specials, specialized weapons holstered in worn leather, meticulously cared for. They scanned the street, their eyes missing nothing. Not the peeling paint on the general store, not the nervous face peeking from behind a curtain, not the sheriff's office, which they noted with a brief, dismissive glance. They ignored the saloon, the typical first stop for most travelers. A saloon was for pleasure, for noise, for carelessness. Their business was not pleasure. They dismounted in front of Martha's place, their movements synchronous and silent. They tied their horses to the hitching rail and stood for a moment, taking in the layout of the street, their stillness more menacing than any threat. When they entered the eatery, the few remaining patrons fell silent, their conversations dying in their throats. Martha looked up from the counter where she was wiping down a glass, and her friendly facade froze on her face. She had seen countless men in her life, good, bad, and broken. But these 2 were different. They were empty. They carried an aura of cold, detached purpose that made her skin crawl. The elder brother, Elias, a thin, sallow man with eyes like chips of slate, approached the counter. "Ma'am," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, almost polite, but utterly devoid of warmth. "The stew smells good. We'll have 2 bowls, and coffee." They did not wait to be seated. They chose a table in the corner, one that gave them a clear view of the door and the entire room. They sat down, placed their hats on the table, and waited. They did not speak to each other. They simply watched, their presence a suffocating weight, turning the humble eatery into a tense, silent theater. Martha's hands trembled slightly as she ladled the stew into 2 bowls. She felt like she was serving the Grim Reaper and his brother. Across the street, Sheriff Gable saw them enter. He watched through the grimy window of his office, his heart beginning to pound a heavy, panicked rhythm against his ribs. He had seen their type before, usually on the blood-spattered pages of a Pinkerton circular. They were fixers, manhunters, the kind of men wealthy, powerful people hired to solve problems quietly and permanently. He knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that they were here because of the hat. His duty was clear. He was the law. He should walk across that street, demand to know their business, and remind them that this town, however small, had a sheriff. His hand rested on the butt of his pistol. He could feel the cold sweat beating on his forehead. He imagined confronting them, imagined their dead, empty eyes turning to him. He thought of their professional-looking guns, and his courage, a small and fragile thing to begin with, completely abandoned him. With a shaking hand, Sheriff Gable reached up and pulled down the green canvas shade over his office window, plunging his own room into a dim, cowardly twilight. It was a definitive act of abdication. He was officially hiding. The town of Sovereign Creek was on its own. In the back of Martha's kitchen, Leo was going over the plan he had formulated, completely unaware of the new arrivals. He was focused on his own small, dangerous mission to retrieve the hat from the Blackwoods, a mission that now seemed like child's play compared to the far greater danger that was sitting in the front room, methodically eating stew. The 2 plot lines, the boy's quest for honor and the killer's quest for silence, were now in the same building, separated only by a flimsy wooden door, ready to collide with catastrophic force. The vultures had landed, and they were patiently waiting for the scent of blood. The Pike brothers finished their stew in a silence that was more profound than any conversation. They ate with a clean, mechanical efficiency, their movements spare and precise. When they were done, Elamain Melisguas, the elder, placed a silver dollar on the table. Far too much for the simple meal. It was not an act of generosity, but of dismissal, a statement that the common currency of this town was of no consequence to them. They stood, nodded once in unison, and walked out into the street, leaving Martha and the few other patrons in the eatery feeling as if a cold front had just passed through. From the kitchen window, Leo watched them, his heart pounding. He expected them to get on their horses and ride away, their business in town concluded. But they did not. They turned, and with the same unhurried, deliberate pace, began walking toward the saloon. The loud, braying laughter of Clay Blackwood could be heard spilling out from its bat-wing doors. Martha came to stand beside Leo, her hand instinctively going to her mouth. She knew. They both knew. The vultures had found their target. The saloon was Clay Blackwood's court. He was holding forth at the bar, Hatcher's hat on his head, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in his hand, regaling his cronies with another embellished story of his own imagined prowess. The room was loud, smoky, and reeked of stale beer and arrogance. When the Pike brothers stepped through the doors, the room didn't just go quiet. The very air seemed to thicken, to become heavy and hard to breathe. Cole Pike, the larger of the two brothers, remained by the entrance, a silent, menacing sentinel. Elias walked through the crowd, which parted before him as if he were a leper. He moved with a liquid grace that was unnerving, stopping directly behind Clay Blackwood. "Pardon the interruption," Elias said, his voice soft enough that only Clay and the bartender could hear it clearly. Clay, annoyed at the break in his performance, turned around, a belligerent scowl on his face. "What do you want?" he demanded. Elias Pike's eyes were not on Clay's face, but on the hat. "That's a handsome piece of headwear," he said, his tone one of polite, academic interest. "My employer is a collector of curiosities. He has an interest in the provenance of that particular item. We would be most grateful if you could tell us its story." The use of a word like provenance was a deliberate choice, a subtle signal that these were not common men. But the subtlety was lost on Clay. All he saw was a thin, quiet man who was not showing him the proper degree of fear. Clay had only one way of dealing with the world: intimidation. He puffed out his chest, leaning on the bar with a proprietary air. "The story is, I took it off a yellow-bellied drifter who didn't have the sand to hold on to it," Clay sneered. "And that's the end of the story. Now, unless you're buying around, I suggest you move along." He made to turn his back on Elias, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. It was the last mistake Clay Blackwood would make as a whole man. In a blur of motion too swift for the eye to properly track, Elias Pike's left hand shot out and clamped onto Clay's right wrist. His right hand grabbed Clay's elbow. Before Clay could even register the touch, Elias pivoted, using Clay's own forward momentum against him, and torqued the arm over his shoulder. There was a wet, sickening snap that cut through the silence of the saloon. It was the sound of the thick bone in Clay Blackwood's forearm breaking cleanly in two. Clay let out a scream that was not human, a high, piercing shriek of pure, unadulterated agony. His legs gave out from under him, and he crumpled to the filthy floorboards, cradling his now useless, horribly bent arm. The bottle of whiskey shattered beside him. The hat, dislodged by the violent movement, fell from his head and rolled under a nearby table. The entire saloon was frozen in a state of collective shock and terror. Jeb Blackwood, who had been laughing a second before, scrambled backward, his chair toppling over as he tried to crab walk away from the scene. By the door, Cole Pike had drawn his long-barreled revolver, not aiming it at anyone in particular, but simply holding it, letting its cold, deadly presence enforce the silence. Elias Pike looked down at the screaming, writhing man on the floor, his face completely impassive, as if he were observing an interesting insect. He crouched down beside Clay, his movements calm and unhurried. He leaned in close, his soft voice a terrifying counterpoint to Clay's agonized cries. "I believe," Elias Pike said gently, "that I was asking you a question. Let's try again. Where did you get the hat?" From the sliver of space between the kitchen door and its frame, Leo saw it all. He had been listening, waiting for the telltale sounds of the Blackwood's departure, his own simple plan of ambush ready in his mind. But the sound that came was not the boisterous exit of a drunk. It was the sickening, wet snap of a breaking bone, followed by a scream that clawed its way down Leo's spine and settled deep in his gut. He was frozen, his eye pressed to the crack in the door, a silent, terrified witness to a kind of violence he had never imagined. The patrons of the saloon were like statues carved from fear, their faces pale and slack. Jeb Blackwood was a whimpering, pathetic heap on the floor. And Clay, the arrogant, untouchable king of Sovereign Creek, was reduced to a screaming child, his body contorted in agony. The casual, almost bored efficiency of the two strangers was the most terrifying part. They moved as if this level of brutality was a mundane, everyday chore, like saddling a horse or mending a fence. Leo watched, his breath caught in his throat, as the thinner brother, Elias Pike, ignored the screaming Clay completely. He calmly walked to the table where the hat had fallen. He knelt down, picked it up, and held it with a strange sort of reverence. He brushed the dust from its brim with a gentle sweeping motion. It was the gesture of a man recovering a holy relic, and it sent a wave of pure ice through Leo's veins. They weren't here for the Blackwoods. They were here for the hat. Elias Pike turned his cold, empty eyes on the weeping Jeb. "Your brother mentioned a drifter," he said, his voice soft. "A boy. He said you took this hat from him. Tell me about the boy." Jeb, in his terror, babbled the whole story. "Just a kid, a skinny drifter, new in town. We was just having some fun with him, that's all. In the eatery, across the street. He didn't want no trouble." Elias Pike's gaze flickered for a fraction of a second toward the front windows of the saloon, in the direction of Martha's place. He and his brother exchanged a look of silent, perfect understanding. The hat was a lead. The boy was the target. Their mission had just become horrifyingly clear. They left Clay Blackwood writhing on the floor. In a final, chilling gesture of their cold professionalism, Elias tossed a silver eagle onto the bar. "For the damages," he said to the petrified bartender. Then he and his brother walked out of the saloon, Hatcher's hat now in their possession. Leo pulled back from the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He expected them to get on their horses and ride after him, wherever they thought he'd gone. But they didn't. He peered back through the crack and saw them stop in the middle of the dusty street. They stood there, two dark sentinels, and they began to scan the buildings. The saloon, the general store, the marshal's office. And then, their heads turned in unison, their dead eyes seeming to fix directly on the front window of Martha's place. He was trapped. "Get down," Martha whispered, her voice tight with a fear she was barely holding in check. She pulled him away from the door and into the shadows of the kitchen. "They know you were here. They'll come looking." The full, catastrophic reality of his situation crashed down on Leo. This wasn't about a stolen hat anymore. It wasn't about a schoolyard bully. These men were professionals, killers, and they were here because of him, because of the promise he'd made to a dying man. He thought of the journal, wrapped in its oilskin, and sewn into the lining of his saddlebags back at the livery. He had thought that keeping it separate from the hat was a clever precaution. Now, he realized it was the only thing keeping him alive. These men weren't just here to kill him. They were here to find what Hatcher had given him. He looked at Martha, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. He finally understood. Tom Hatcher hadn't just given him a hat as a disguise. He had given him the hat as bait. He was meant to draw the attention, to be the public face of the mystery, while the real prize, the journal, remained hidden. Hatcher, in his final moments, had turned his own protege into a walking target, a sacrificial pawn in a much deadlier game. The weight of that realization, of that terrible, necessary love, was almost too much to bear. The boy who had dreamed of a simple theft was now a witness to a brutal assault, and the target of a murder investigation where he was the intended victim. Panic was a physical thing, a rising tide of ice water in Leo's chest. He was trapped. The two killers were outside, methodical and patient, and his own name was the only thing on their lips. He shrank back into the shadows of Martha's storeroom, the scent of dried herbs and flour thick in the air, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He wanted to run, to burrow into the deepest, darkest corner and never come out. His mind was a whirlwind of terror. And then, through the storm of his fear, came a voice. It was not a sound in the room, but a memory, as clear and steady as if the man were standing right beside him. It was the voice of Marshal Tom Hatcher. Panic is a poison, Leo, the worst kind. It clouds the mind and makes a man his own worst enemy. When you feel it rising, you don't run. You stop. You anchor yourself. You breathe. And then you watch. You just watch. Because a man can't hide who he truly is for long. Sooner or later, his habits will always give him away. The memory, from a quiet evening by a campfire months ago, was so powerful it cut through Leo's terror. He leaned against a sack of pinto beans, closed his eyes, and forced himself to breathe. In, out. He felt his frantic heartbeat begin to slow, the icy panic receding just enough for thought to take root. Watch. He crept from the storeroom back into the kitchen, to a small, grimy window that looked out onto the side alley. From there, he had a slivered view of the street and the two killers. They were standing near their horses, speaking in low tones. They thought he was hiding, waiting to be found. They were right. But now, he was hiding and watching. A new memory surfaced. Hatcher and him, sitting in a crowded train station, watching people come and go. "Look there," Hatcher had murmured, nodding toward a well-dressed man in a fancy suit. "See the way he keeps checking that pocket watch? Not because he's worried about the time. It's a habit, a nervous tick. He's impatient. An impatient man is a predictable man, Leo. He'll always choose the fastest path, not the smartest one. A patient man will wait out a storm. An impatient man will try to run through it and get struck by lightning." Leo focused on the two killers in the street. The elder brother, Elias, was a statue of lethal patience. He stood perfectly still, his eyes scanning the town with a slow, methodical gaze. He could wait for an eternity. But the younger one, Cole, was fidgety. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He adjusted the collar of his shirt. He kept glancing up at the sun, as if annoyed by its slow progress across the sky. He was the impatient one, the lightning rod. This was the first chink in their armor, the first weakness Leo could see. They were a unit, but they were not identical. One was patient, the other was not. The final memory came, the most important lesson Hatcher had ever taught him. They had been tracking a wily outlaw, a man who had eluded posses for months. "This man, Brandish, he's arrogant," Hatcher had explained as they studied the trail. "He thinks he's smarter than any lawman. So we're not going to try and outsmart him. We're going to let him outsmart himself. We're going to make a mistake, leave a false trail that looks obvious. He's so prideful, he'll think he's seen through our trick, and he'll follow it just to prove he's clever. And at the end of that trail, we'll be waiting. You don't hunt the man himself, Leo. You hunt his nature, you hunt his pride, you hunt his impatience." Leo's mind, now clear and cold, began to work. The killers expected him to be a terrified boy. They expected him to hide, and when he could hide no longer, to run. They were hunting a rabbit. What if he gave them one? What if he used their own expectations against them? What if he used the younger brother's impatience to separate him from the patient one? It was a terrifying gamble, a plan formed from the lessons of a dead man and the desperation of a trapped boy. But it was a plan. It was the first time since Hatcher's death that Leo wasn't just reacting, wasn't just running or hiding. He was thinking. He was analyzing. He was preparing to hunt the habits of his own hunters. He turned from the window. Martha was watching him, her face pale. She saw the change in him. The raw panic in his eyes was gone, replaced by a look of sharp, dangerous calculation she recognized all too well. It was the look Tom Hatcher used to get right before he brought all hell down on some unsuspecting fool who had underestimated him. The boy was gone. The student was about to begin his final exam. The plan was a whisper of an idea, born of a dead man's lessons and a living boy's terror. Leo, his mind now a cold, clear instrument, laid it out for Martha in the quiet shadows of her kitchen. He needed rope, strong and thin. He needed to know the layout of the alleys behind the main street, the maze of sheds and refuse piles that was the town's hidden geography. Martha, her eyes alight with a dangerous, vicarious thrill, provided what he needed from her storeroom, a length of old hemp rope strong enough to tether a mule. She confirmed the layout he'd sketched in his mind, her knowledge of the town's underbelly as thorough as her knowledge of its public face. The waiting was the hardest part. For what felt like an eternity, the Pike brothers stood in the street, patient and still, a silent testament to the town's paralysis. Then, as Leo had predicted, the impatient brothers' resolve began to fray. "He's not coming out," Cole Pike said to his brother, his voice a low, irritated rumble. "We could wait here all day. I'll take the alleys. You keep an eye on the street. We'll flush him out." Elias, the elder, gave a slow, reluctant nod. It was a break in their disciplined formation, but he knew his brother's fidgety nature would soon become a liability. "Be thorough," was all he said. The trap was set. The moment Cole Pike disappeared into the narrow passage between the general store and the assayer's office, Leo slipped out the back of the eatery. He moved like a wraith through the familiar territory of back lots he had just studied on Martha's map. He found a stack of empty wooden crates behind the saloon and, with a deep breath, shoved them over. They fell with a loud, clumsy crash, the sound of a panicked fugitive making a desperate, foolish break for freedom. Just as he'd hoped, Cole Pike took the bait. He heard the noise and assumed it was the boy making a run for it. He began to move quickly through the maze of alleys, his gun drawn, his impatience making him reckless. But there was another player in the game. Jeb Blackwood, his brother now in the care of the town's doctor, and his own courage completely gone, had decided to flee. He slipped out the back door of the saloon, intending to sneak out of town and ride for the safety of his father's ranch. He scurried down the same alley as the approaching killer. Cole Pike rounded a corner and came face to face with Jeb. For a moment, they both froze. To the killer, Jeb wasn't the target, but he was a witness, a loose end. "You," Cole snarled, raising his revolver. "Where's the other one? The drifter?" Jeb, paralyzed with a fear so absolute he couldn't speak, just shook his head, whimpering. Cole's cold eyes narrowed. There was no time for this. He would silence this loose end and continue his hunt. He thumbed back the hammer of his Colt. From the low roof of the adjacent blacksmith shop, Leo watched it happen. He saw the killer corner his tormentor. A part of him, a dark, vengeful part, whispered that this was justice. Jeb was a coward who had laughed while his brother assaulted him. He deserved this. But then he heard Hatcher's voice in his memory. Not a specific lesson, but the calm, steady timbre of the man's character. Hatcher would not have stood by and watched an unarmed man, no matter how worthless, be shot down in cold blood. The promise Leo had made was not just to deliver a journal. It was to uphold the code of the man who had written it. He had to act. But a direct confrontation was suicide. So he relied on his mentor's other lessons. While Cole's attention was on Jeb, Leo put his own trap into motion. He had tied the hemp rope he'd gotten from Martha taut across the alleyway, about 10 feet behind Cole, securing it to 2 heavy rain barrels. It was ankle high, nearly invisible in the deep shadows. To spring the trap, he needed a distraction. He picked up a small, loose stone from the rooftop and threw it against the far wall of the alley, to the left of the 2 men. The sharp clack of the stone made Cole flinch and turn toward the sound. In that split second of distraction, Jeb saw his chance and bolted, running blindly back the way he had come. "Get back here!" Cole roared, his frustration boiling over. He spun and charged after Jeb, his long strides eating up the ground. He ran directly into the unseen rope. The tanglefoot snare worked perfectly. Cole's feet were swept out from under him, and he went down hard, crashing into the dusty ground with a grunt of pain and surprise. His revolver flew from his grasp, skittering into a pile of refuse. The fall was loud, violent, and disorienting. Jeb, without looking back, scrambled out of the alley and disappeared. Leo didn't wait to see the outcome. He slipped off the back of the roof and vanished into the warren of sheds and backlots, his heart pounding, a grim satisfaction mixing with his fear. Cole Pike pushed himself to his feet, his face a mask of incandescent fury. He was not injured, but his pride was shattered. He had been tricked, played for a fool by a boy. He retrieved his gun and stalked back to the main street, where his brother met him, his face grim. "He was here," Cole growled. "The boy. He's faster than he looks, and smarter." Elias Pike's cold eyes scanned the empty alleys. He now understood. Their prey was not a simple rabbit to be cornered. He was a trickster, a ghost who knew the terrain and could turn their own strengths against them. The hunt had fundamentally changed, and for the first time, they were no longer certain who was the hunter and who was the hunted. Jeb Blackwood ran without thinking, his mind a white-hot blank of pure terror. He scrambled through the alleys of Sovereign Creek, expecting at any moment to feel a bullet in his back. He didn't run for the sheriff's office. He knew Gable was useless. He didn't run for home. That felt a world away. Instinct, or perhaps the memory of a kind face, led him to the one place in town that felt like a sanctuary. He pounded on the back door of Martha's Eatery, his knuckles raw, his voice a choked sob. Martha, her face grim, pulled him inside and shoved him down the narrow steps into her root cellar, a cool, dark space that smelled of earth and potatoes. "Stay here and be silent," she commanded, before closing the heavy door, plunging him into darkness. A few minutes later, the door opened again. A single lantern was lowered into the cellar, its light throwing long, dancing shadows. Holding the lantern was Leo. He descended the steps and stood before the huddled, whimpering form of the man who, just hours earlier, had laughed at his humiliation. The tables had turned with a dizzying, brutal finality. The first thing Jeb did was thrust out a trembling hand. Clutched in it was Marshal Hatcher's hat. In his panicked flight from the saloon, he had snatched it from the floor, instinctively knowing it was the source of his terror. "Here," he gasped, shoving it at Leo. "Take it. It's yours. It's cursed. Just tell them I gave it back. Tell them I'm sorry." Leo took the hat. He held it for a long moment, the familiar weight a strange mixture of comfort and dread. He placed it carefully, reverently, on a nearby potato crate. "That's not going to be enough, Jeb," Leo said, his voice quiet and cold, devoid of the fear Jeb had heard before. "They aren't after a hat. They're after the man who used to wear it. They're after what he knew." He took a step closer, his shadow looming over the terrified bully. "You and your brother work for your father, and your father works for Silas Corrigan. Tell me why Corrigan wanted Marshal Hatcher dead." The name, spoken with such certainty in the dark, seemed to break something in Jeb. The dam of his family's secrets, held together by fear and greed, burst. The words came tumbling out, a frantic, desperate confession from a man who believed he was pleading for his life. "It was the mine!" he babbled, tears and snot running down his face. "The Silver Queen up in the foothills. It was a sham, right from the start. There was never any silver in it. Not really. Corrigan and my father, they salted it. hauled in a few wagon loads of high-grade ore from another claim, and peppered the walls with it. Just enough to look good. He explained the whole sordid affair. They had used the salted mine to attract a group of wealthy investors from back east, selling them shares in a worthless hole in the ground for a fortune. It was a classic frontier scam, writ large. Hatcher, he got wind of it, Jeb continued, his voice trembling. He was smart. He wasn't looking at land deeds. He was looking at freight manifests. He saw that the ore they were shipping out didn't match the ore that was supposed to be coming in. He was asking questions, getting too close to the truth. Corrigan said he had to be silenced. Leo listened, his face a mask of stone. This was it. The motive. The sin that had cost Tom Hatcher his life. It wasn't a crime of passion or a simple robbery. It was a cold-blooded murder to protect a financial empire built on lies. The journal, Leo said, the words sharp as glass. Hatcher kept a journal with all his evidence. Where is it? I don't know, Jeb cried, holding up his hands. I swear I don't. We never found it. That's why Corrigan sent those men. He's terrified that book survived. He leaned forward, his eyes wide with a new, more immediate fear. And he's coming here, to the ranch. Supposed to be here by the end of the week. There's a big shipment of rifles coming down from the north, smuggled, part of his business. He's coming to oversee the exchange himself. This was the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. Leo now had the whole story. The motive, the villain, the crime. And now, he had a location and a timeline. Corrigan himself was coming here. He was riding directly into the hornet's nest that Hatcher's legacy had stirred up. Leo stood up, his mind clear, the path ahead laid bare. His personal quest was over. He had reclaimed the hat. But Marshal Hatcher's mission, the promise made in the dust of that canyon, was just beginning. He looked down at the pathetic, broken bully at his feet, a man who had been a fearsome tyrant just that morning. Then he turned, took the hat from the crate, and ascended the stairs, leaving Jeb alone in the darkness with his ghosts. Failure was a taste the Pike brothers had rarely experienced, and it was as bitter as alkali dust. They rode out of Sovereign Creek under the cloak of darkness, their professional pride in tatters, their mission a complete disaster. They had been dispatched by the most powerful man in the territory to eliminate a boy and retrieve a hat. Instead, they had been outmaneuvered, tricked, and humiliated by their target, leaving one of their key local contacts, Clay Blackwood, with a shattered arm and his brother a quivering, useless wreck. They had recovered the hat, yes, but they had failed in their primary objective, to locate the journal and eliminate the ghost of Tom Hatcher. They couldn't risk using the telegraph in Sovereign Creek, so they rode through the night, pushing their horses hard for the next town on the line, a dusty rail junction called San Gabriel. It was a miserable, silent ride, each man lost in the contemplation of their own incompetence and the much more terrifying contemplation of their employer's wrath. Silas Corrigan was a man who paid handsomely for success, but the price he extracted for failure was something no one wanted to calculate. They arrived in San Gabriel at dawn, two grim, exhausted figures. They found the telegraph office and Elias, the elder brother, took a slip of paper and a pencil. For a long time, he just stared at it, trying to find the right words. How did one report a catastrophe? How did one explain to a man like Corrigan that his two best killers had been outwitted by a teenager? He chose his words carefully, trying to frame their failure not as incompetence, but as a result of unforeseen complications. He wrote, SC encountered target. Situation more complex than anticipated. Target is not an amateur. Displays tactical knowledge. Local assets. Blackwoods. Compromised and useless. Hat secured but journal not found. Believe target is protected or has allies. Awaiting new directive. Pike. He slid the paper to the operator, a sleepy man who took their money without comment, and tapped out the message. Then came the worst part. The waiting. The Pike brothers took a room at the town's dingy hotel and waited for Corrigan's reply. They didn't speak. They just sat in the stuffy room, the air thick with tension. Each tick of the clock on the wall a countdown to their master's judgment. Back in Santa Fe, Silas Corrigan read the decoded message, and the icy composure he so carefully maintained finally cracked. A dark, venomous fury contorted his handsome features. "Resourceful, protected," he hissed to the empty room, crushing the telegram in his fist. He had underestimated the situation. He had underestimated Hatcher. The old Marshal, even in death, was proving to be a formidable adversary. Corrigan realized his mistake. This boy wasn't some lucky drifter who had stumbled upon a dead man's hat. The tactical knowledge Fletcher and now the Pikes reported, the ability to outmaneuver trained killers. This was no accident. This was training. Hatcher had been grooming a protege, a secret apprentice. And if Hatcher had trained the boy, he would have undoubtedly entrusted him with the one thing that truly mattered: the journal. The boy had it. He had to have it. And a boy this clever would know exactly what to do with it. The threat was no longer a minor irritation. It was an existential crisis. His carefully constructed empire, his political connections, his very freedom. It all depended on that journal remaining buried. The surgical approach had failed. The time for scalpels was over. It was now time for a sledgehammer. He stormed back to his desk and wrote out a reply to the Pike brothers, his handwriting a furious, jagged scrawl. "Stay in San Gabriel. Your services are no longer required for this task. I will handle this personally." He then sent a flurry of other telegrams to his operatives stationed throughout the territory, his words sharp and clear. He summoned his main enforcers. A dozen of the most ruthless hired guns on his payroll, not just killers, but a private army. He gave them a rendezvous point and a single, simple objective. His final telegram was to his foreman at the Blackwood Ranch. "Expecting me in 2 days, not a week. Gather all available men. We are going to burn a ghost out of Sovereign Creek." Silas Corrigan stood before the large map of the territory that hung on his wall. He looked at the tiny, insignificant dot that represented the town where this problem festered. His initial annoyance had transformed into a cold, murderous rage. He was done sending proxies. He was done underestimating his opponent. He would ride there himself, at the head of a small army, and he would tear the town apart, board by board, until he found the journal and the boy. He would not just erase the ghost of Tom Hatcher, he would obliterate its memory from the face of the earth. The trouble did not arrive like a whisper this time. It arrived like a flood. 2 days after the Pike brothers fled, just as a fragile sense of normalcy had begun to settle over Sovereign Creek, a lone rider was spotted on the eastern ridge. Then another on the western bluff. Then 2 more appeared on the high butte to the south. Within minutes, the entire town was ringed by a dozen silent mounted figures. They were not a posse, they were an army. The people of Sovereign Creek poured out of their homes and businesses, their faces turning pale with a dawning collective horror. They looked up at the silent sentinels, who now held the high ground, effectively sealing the valley. These were not the common thugs of the Blackwood gang, or even the professional, but limited threat of the Pike brothers. These were seasoned, hard-faced men, each armed with a Winchester 1873 repeating rifle, the infamous gun that won the West. The glint of the sun on their rifle barrels was a promise of a storm of lead that the town could not possibly hope to weather. Then, on the highest point of the ridge directly overlooking the main street, another rider appeared, separating himself from the others. He sat upon a magnificent black stallion, his posture ramrod straight, his tailored suit a stark, civilized contrast to the rugged killers he commanded. Even from a distance, Leo recognized the arrogant authority of the man. It was Silas Corrigan. He had come not to delegate, but to conquer. He looked down on the small, terrified town, as a Roman general might look upon a rebellious village, a place to be made an example of. Corrigan did not shout. He did not need to. He simply raised a gloved hand. In perfect, terrifying unison, his dozen gunmen raised their Winchester rifles to the sky. He dropped his hand. A single, coordinated volley of fire erupted, a deafening, rolling thunderclap that shook the very foundations of the buildings. It was not an attack. It was a demonstration. It was a show of force, of discipline, and of the overwhelming firepower at his command. It was a promise of swift and total annihilation. The sound shattered the last vestiges of the town's courage. Panic, raw and absolute, erupted in the street below. People screamed and ran for cover, a disorganized, terrified mob. Sheriff Gable, his face the color of wet ash, burst out of his office. He had seen enough. This was not a fight. It was a death sentence. "It's over," he yelled, his voice cracking with a fear that bordered on hysteria. "We can't fight this. We have to give them the boy. It's our only chance." He ran through the street, a lawman openly advocating for the sacrifice of a person he was sworn to protect, his own terror having completely supplanted his duty. From the window of the eatery, Leo and Martha watched the scene unfold. Leo's hand went to the brim of Hatcher's hat, which now sat on his own head. It felt impossibly heavy, a crown of lead. He saw the disciplined gunmen, the modern repeating rifles, the cold, ruthless man orchestrating it all from the hill. He saw the town's panic, the sheriff's cowardice, and he knew this was it. This was the end of the trail that had started in that bloody canyon. The forces Hatcher had fought against in secret had now come out into the open, and they had come for him. He had brought this doom upon these people. The weight of that guilt was a crushing thing. He was just a boy, and he had led a private army to the doorstep of this small, fragile town. He felt Martha's hand on his shoulder. He looked at her, expecting to see fear or accusation in her eyes. Instead, he saw the same hard, flinty resolve he had seen before. She was not afraid. She was angry. "Tom Hatcher never backed down from a fight in his life," she said, her voice low and steady amidst the rising chaos outside. "Especially not when the odds were long, and the cause was right. The question is, what are you going to do?" Corrigan made no further move. He simply sat on his horse on the hill, a patient serpent in the garden he was about to set ablaze. He let the town stew in the terror his demonstration had created. He knew that fear was a more effective weapon than any bullet. He would let them tear each other apart with it, let their own survival instinct convince them to do his dirty work for him. The siege had begun, not with a charge, but with a single, deafening volley that had already broken the spirit of the law and sown the seeds of betrayal among the people. The fate of Sovereign Creek now rested on the shoulders of a boy who was only just beginning to understand the true weight of the hat he wore. Silas Corrigan did not need a telegraph to send his next message. He possessed a voice accustomed to command, and he let the valley's natural acoustics carry his words down to the terrified people huddled in the street below. His tone was not one of anger, but of magnanimous, terrible reason. The voice of a king pronouncing judgment on a disobedient province. people of Sovereign Creek," he boomed, each word sharp and distinct. "You find yourselves in an unfortunate position. You are harboring a thief, a young man who has stolen an item of great personal value to me, a private journal. This is a simple matter of property retrieval." He paused, letting the lie settle. He was framing his murderous intent as a simple civil dispute. "Your town has nothing to do with this, and I bear you no ill will," he continued, his voice a balm of false reassurance. "My quarrel is with the boy, and the boy alone. Send him out to me with the journal, and my men and I will depart peacefully. I will even give you my word that your women and children may leave the town now, unharmed. You have my guarantee of their safe passage." This was a masterful stroke of psychological cruelty, an offer of mercy that was designed to fracture the town's resolve, to turn husband against wife, parent against child. Then came the ultimatum. "If you refuse this generous offer," Corrigan's voice hardened, the velvet glove coming off to reveal the iron fist. "If you choose to protect this thief, then you have chosen to make his crime your own. You have until sunset. If the boy and the journal are not delivered to me by then, I will give my men the order to burn your town to the ground. Every building will be turned to ash. No quarter will be given. The choice is yours." He finished speaking, and a profound, terrible silence descended, broken only by the sound of a woman beginning to sob. The town had been given its choice: sacrifice the boy or face annihilation. It was Sheriff Gable who broke the spell. His face was a mask of pure, primal terror. All pretense of duty, of law, of honor was gone, burned away by his own desperate need to survive. "You heard him!" he shrieked, turning to the stunned crowd. "It's the boy he wants. Just the boy. This isn't our fight." He began to move through the crowd, his eyes wild, grabbing men by the arm. "We have to do it. It's the only way. One life for all of ours. It's simple arithmetic." He was no longer a lawman. He was a priest of cowardice, trying to rally a congregation to perform a human sacrifice. "We'll form a posse. We'll go into the eatery, and we'll drag him out ourselves. We'll give Corrigan what he wants." A few men, their faces slack with fear, nodded in agreement, ready to follow any path that promised survival, no matter how shameful. But before the mob could gain momentum, a new voice cut through the panic. "You'll do no such thing, Horace Gable." Martha stood in the doorway of her eatery, an old, double-barreled shotgun held with a steady, practiced grip in her hands. Her face was like granite. "The only posse you'll be forming is one to march you straight out of this town for dereliction of duty." She looked past the sheriff to the faces in the crowd. "Have you all lost your minds? You're going to trade the life of a boy to a man who sent killers here in the first place. Do you think his word is worth anything? He'll take the boy, and then he'll kill us all as witnesses. Tom Hatcher died fighting that snake. Are you really going to hand his legacy over without a fight?" Her words, full of righteous fire, shamed some into silence. The crowd wavered, caught between the sheriff's frantic pleas for survival and Martha's appeal to their conscience. It was Leo who ended the debate. He walked out of the eatery, past Martha, and stood on the small porch. He had placed Hatcher's hat firmly on his head. It no longer looked like a borrowed crown. He looked as if he had finally grown into it. He faced the sheriff and the divided town, his expression calm and resolute. "Marshal Hatcher taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by how he lives when things are easy," Leo said, his voice quiet, but carrying a strange new authority that made everyone fall silent. "It's measured by what he does when he's scared, by the choices he makes when the odds are impossible." He looked at Sheriff Gable, his eyes holding not anger, but a kind of pity. "You're right, Sheriff. It is a simple choice, but you've got the arithmetic all wrong. It's not about one life versus 100. It's about whether this town is a place worth saving in the first place." Then he turned his head, and looked up at the figure on the hill. He took a deep breath and shouted, his voice ringing with a strength no one knew he possessed. "You hear me, Corrigan? You want the journal? You want the ghost of Tom Hatcher? Then you'll have to come down here and get him yourself. We're not giving you anything." It was a declaration of war, a gauntlet thrown down by a boy who had finally decided to be a man. The wavering townspeople looked from their terrified, cowering sheriff to the defiant young man in the marshal's hat. The choice was no longer theirs to make. Leo had made it for them. And now, they had to decide if they had the courage to stand with him. Leo's shout echoed in the valley, a single, sharp note of defiance against an ocean of silence. For a long moment, no one in the street moved. The townspeople were a frozen tableau of fear and indecision, caught between the sheriff's panicked plea for surrender and the boy's impossible declaration of war. The future of Sovereign Creek balanced on a knife's edge. The first person to move was Martha. With a look of utter contempt at the sputtering Sheriff Gable, she cocked both hammers of the old shotgun she held. The loud double click was a sound of finality. It was her vote. She walked to the eatery's porch and stood beside Leo, a silent, unyielding ally. "The boy is right," she said, her voice ringing with clarity. "I'd rather my business burn to the ground as a part of a town that stood for something than serve drinks in a town that sold its soul." Her courage, like a spark in dry tinder, ignited something in the crowd. The town blacksmith, a burly man who had watched the events unfold with a growing sense of shame, threw down the saddle he'd been mending. He walked over, grabbing a heavy-headed smithing hammer from his shop as he passed. "She's right," he grunted, taking his place beside them. No more hiding. Young Ben, the stable hand, appeared from the livery, his eyes wide, but his hands clutching a rusty single-shot rifle that was almost as tall as he was. He ran to join them, his youthful fear eclipsed by his admiration for Leo. Then came the most unlikely volunteer of all. Jeb Blackwood, his face still pale and streaked with tears, emerged from the crowd. He was no longer the swaggering bully. He was a humbled, terrified young man who had been given a second chance at life by the very person he had wronged. He held his own revolver with a shaking hand, but he held it nonetheless. He saved me," Jeb stammered to the stunned onlookers. "Those men would have killed me. I owe him." He took his place on the porch, a boy trying to pay a debt of honor he was only just beginning to understand. Seeing this small, defiant band forming, Sheriff Gable and his faction of frightened townspeople simply melted away, scurrying back into their homes and storefronts to lock the doors and hide from the consequences of the coming battle. They had made their choice, and it was to be absent from their town's finest and perhaps final hour. Leo looked at his small, ragtag army, an old woman with a shotgun, a blacksmith with a hammer, a stable boy with an antique rifle, and the ghost of a bully seeking redemption. It wasn't an army. It was a prayer. But it was all he had, and in that moment, the weight of their trust settled on his shoulders, and he finally stood up straight beneath it. The teachings of Tom Hatcher, once a confusing jumble of lessons, now became a clear and precise battle plan. "All right, listen to me," Leo said, his voice taking on the calm, authoritative tone of his mentor. He was no longer asking, he was commanding. "We can't win a straight-up fight. We have to be smarter. We use the town. We make them come to us." For the next hour, as the sun began its slow, final descent, they worked with a feverish intensity. Leo directed them, his mind seeing the town not as a collection of buildings, but as a tactical map. "Blacksmith, that heavy freight wagon, we need it overturned across the main street. right between the eatery and the general store. It's our main barricade," he commanded. The big man, grateful for a task that required his strength, complied immediately. "Martha, Ben, you're our eyes. Get up on the roof of the eatery. You can see the whole valley from there. Don't fire unless they get past the barricade. Your job is to tell us where they're coming from." "Jeb," he said, turning to the nervous young man. Jeb flinched. "The livery loft. It's got thick walls and a good angle on the west trail. They'll try to flank us. You and Ben's rifle are our only defense on that side. Can you do it?" Jeb swallowed hard and gave a shaky but determined nod. They dragged heavy sacks of flour and grain from the general store, creating secondary cover. They overturned tables from the saloon. They shattered the glass in the upper windows of the buildings to prevent the sun's last rays from glinting and giving away their positions. They were not just building defenses. They were transforming Sovereign Creek into a weapon. As the sun finally touched the horizon, painting the clouds in brilliant, bloody strokes of orange and red, the work was done. The deadline had arrived. The small band of defenders took their positions. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and terrified. But they were united. From behind the main barricade, Leo looked at the ring of silent figures on the hills. He settled Hatcher's hat on his head. It no longer felt heavy. It felt right. He gave a single, sharp nod to Martha on the roof. They were ready. From his perch on the hill, Silas Corrigan, a man accustomed to having his will imposed upon the world, with effortless precision, watched the sun dip below the horizon. His deadline had passed. His generous offer had been met with a boy's defiant shout. A flicker of genuine disbelief, quickly followed by a cold wave of fury, passed across his face. He gave a small, almost bored flick of his wrist. It was the signal. The flood began. The dozen riders on the hills spurred their horses downward, a wave of dark figures converging on the small, defiant town. The air, which had been still with suspense, erupted into a deafening roar as they opened fire with their Winchester repeating rifles. The sheer volume of lead they threw at the town was terrifying. A wall of noise and splintering wood designed to induce shock and immediate surrender. They charged forward, expecting the handful of defenders to break and run. They had underestimated the defenses, and they had underestimated the boy in the Marshal's hat. "Hold your fire," Leo's voice cut through the din, sharp and clear. "Wait for them to commit. Make every shot count." His small band of defenders, their knuckles white on their weapons, obeyed. They hunkered down behind their makeshift barricades, the world exploding around them, and they waited. The main force of 6 riders, led by Corrigan himself, charged down the main street, straight toward the overturned wagon. At the same time, the remaining gunmen swung west, intending to flank the town and attack from the rear, just as Leo had predicted. They galloped down the narrow alley beside the livery, a perfect, tight channel. From the hayloft above, Jeb Blackwood watched them enter the alley, his heart hammering against his ribs. He remembered Leo's instructions. Wait until the alley is full. Don't aim for the first man, aim for the man in the middle. Create chaos. He saw the gunmen funneled below him, a perfect example of what Marshal Hatcher had called enfilading fire. With a ragged yell that was half terror and half a war cry, Jeb leaned out and emptied his revolver down the length of the alley. From the rooftop of the eatery, young Ben's rusty rifle cracked, adding to the crossfire. The flanking force, caught completely by surprise in the narrow trap, was thrown into chaos. One rider fell from his horse, another's mount was hit and went down, blocking the path. The flank had been broken by the 2 youngest and most unlikely defenders. On the main street, Corrigan's force met the barricade. They were met with sparse but devastatingly accurate fire. The blacksmith stood like a bear, using his hammer to shatter the knee of a horse that got too close. From behind the barricade, Leo fired with a calm deliberation that was terrifying, his shots not wild, but aimed, forcing the attackers to seek cover. The charge stalled. Corrigan, his face a mask of apoplectic rage, could not believe what he was seeing. His private army, his force of professional killers, was being held at bay by a handful of shopkeepers and children. His arrogance, the very core of his being, could not abide the humiliation. He spurred his stallion forward, leaping the barricade in a magnificent display of horsemanship, determined to break the stalemate and kill the boy himself. He landed in the space behind the barricade, his revolver blazing. The blacksmith roared and charged him with his hammer, but one of Corrigan's men shot him in the leg, sending him to the ground. It was now down to Leo. He didn't meet Corrigan's charge head-on. He dodged back, using the skills Hatcher had taught him, and ran into the blackened ruin of the blacksmith's forge. Corrigan, dismounting, followed him in, a predator cornering his prey. "Nowhere left to run, boy," Corrigan snarled, stepping into the dark, smoky interior. As he stepped past a heavy, ceiling-high shelf laden with old tools and bars of iron, his boot caught on a thin wire stretched across the floor, a wire Leo had placed there minutes before the battle began. The wire pulled a pin from the shelf's main support beam. With a groan of stressed wood, the entire massive shelf tipped forward, crashing down in a deafening avalanche of metal and timber. Corrigan screamed as the shelf pinned his leg to the ground, the impact sending his revolver skittering across the floor. He was trapped, his leg broken, his face a mask of agony and disbelief. Leo stepped out from the shadows where he had been hiding, his own pistol held steady in his hand. He walked over and stood above the helpless, trapped villain. "You killed him," Leo said, his voice cold and quiet. "You shot him in the back from a mile away because you were a coward." Corrigan looked up, his eyes full of hatred. "He was a fool, clinging to a dead world," he spat. "Just like you." Leo raised his pistol, aiming it squarely between Corrigan's eyes. This was the moment. Vengeance for Tom Hatcher, justice for his own fear and humiliation. He thumbed back the hammer, but as he looked down at the pathetic, snarling man, he didn't see a monster. He saw a common bully, made small by his own rage. He saw the hat on his own head, felt the weight of its honor. And he heard Hatcher's voice, not a memory of a lesson, but the memory of his character. Hatcher was the law. Slowly, Leo lowered the pistol. He walked over, picked up Corrigan's revolver, and calmly unloaded it, letting the cartridges fall to the dirt floor. "No," Leo said, turning back to the trapped man. "He wasn't a fool. He was the law, and the law has finally come for you." The battle was over. The debt was paid, not in blood, but in justice. In the quiet that followed, Sovereign Creek began to breathe again. One by one, the townspeople emerged from their homes and hiding places, their faces pale in the twilight. They looked upon a scene of impossible victory. Corrigan's hired guns, their confidence shattered, were throwing down their rifles and surrendering to the blacksmith. Silas Corrigan himself was being pulled from the wreckage of the forge, his leg grotesquely broken, his face a mask of hateful agony. The great and terrible serpent had been decapitated by a handful of determined amateurs, and one very remarkable boy. Sheriff Gable was the last to appear. He stumbled out of his office, his face a ruin of shame and self-loathing. He saw the townsfolk not looking at him, but at Leo, their expressions a mixture of gratitude and pure, the unadulterated awe. He saw Martha directing the blacksmith on how to properly secure Corrigan, her authority unquestioned. He saw that he was irrelevant, a ghost in his own town. In a final, pathetic act of clarity, he unpinned the tin star from his own chest, walked over to the eatery's porch where Martha was standing, and placed it on an empty table. "I reckon," he mumbled to the floorboards, This town deserves better." Without another word, he turned and walked away down the dark street, a man walking away from his own life, disappearing into the obscurity he had chosen over courage. The immediate aftermath was a flurry of grim but necessary work. The wounded were tended to, the prisoners were bound and secured in the now overcrowded jail cells, and the process of cleaning up the wreckage began. Through it all, Leo moved in a sort of daze, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind only a profound and deep exhaustion. He found Hatcher's hat where it had fallen near the barricade and held it in his hands, its weight both a comfort and a burden. It was Martha who approached him as he stood alone in the center of the street. She was holding the sheriff's discarded tin star in her palm. "He was right about one thing," she said, her voice soft. "This town does deserve better." She held the badge out to him. "It seems we have a vacancy for the job of town marshal. No one in their right mind would argue with the appointment. It was a formal offer, a future, a home, a chance to be the man whose hat he held." Leo looked from the simple tin star to the hat in his hands. For so long, his entire purpose had been defined by a promise to a dead man. He had to deliver the journal. He had to protect the hat. Now, the villain was caught. The battle was won. He reached into the inner pocket of his shirt and pulled out the small, oilskin-wrapped journal. It felt warm from his own body heat. He handed it to Martha. "This is what he died for," he said. "This is the evidence against Corrigan. It has to get to the circuit judge when he passes through next month. Can you see that it gets to him? Can you be its guardian now?" He was entrusting the culmination of Hatcher's life's work to her, a transfer of responsibility that was as significant as the one Hatcher had given him. Martha took the journal with a solemn nod. "I'll guard it with my life, Leo. Tom's work won't be for nothing." She still held the badge out to him. "Now, what about your work? Your promise is kept. You're free. You can ride out of here. Leave this all behind." He looked past her, out toward the dark, open plains that stretched to the horizon. He saw the appeal of it, the silence, the solitude, the freedom from responsibility. He could just be a drifter again, a boy with no name and no past. But then he looked back at the town. He saw Jeb Blackwood, his face grim, humbly helping to clear debris. He saw young Ben, already telling an exaggerated version of the story to a wide-eyed group of children. He saw the blacksmith, his leg bandaged, giving him a thumbs up. This wasn't just a town. It was a place he had helped to save, a place he had, against all odds, helped to forge. He made his choice. With a steady hand, he took the tin star from Martha's palm. He didn't hesitate. He pinned it to the front of his worn shirt. Then he took a deep breath and placed Marshal Tom Hatcher's hat on his head. It settled onto his brow, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a heavy, oversized crown. It didn't feel like a disguise or a burden. It felt like it belonged there. It fit. He had arrived in Sovereign Creek as a boy, running from a promise. He would stay as the man who had fulfilled it, and in doing so, had found a new one to make to himself and to the people who now looked to him as their law.